Hello, welcome back to the Michael Sisco Show. I'm your host, Michael Sisco, and we are joined today by a very special guest, Father John Whiteford. Fairly certain that most of my viewers know who you are, Father John, but if you could just give a quick introduction.
Well, I'm the priest of St. Joan Orthodox Church in Spring, Texas, which is just to the north of Houston. And I was raised Nazarene, which is, I used to tell people was like conservative Methodist with Baptist tendencies, but today the Nazarene's more like moderate Methodist with Baptist tendencies, I'm afraid. But I converted back in 1990. And a lot of it had to do with my studying to be a Nazarene minister. I started reading the fathers, and I also came into contact with an Orthodox priest because I was involved in the pro-life movement, and just discovered Orthodoxy. And I didn't leave what I was raised in because I was particularly mad at it or anything like that. I probably would have died a happy Nazarene if my professors hadn't been liberals that were challenging what I'd always been raised to believe. They made me dig deeper. And when I started digging deeper, I started digging into the fathers, and then I discovered that I didn't belong to the same church that the fathers belonged to. Particularly when I read St. Ignatius of Antioch's epistles. After I read his epistles, I knew I didn't belong to the same church that he did, and I figured he probably wasn't the right one, and I wasn't, since he was the disciple of the Apostle John. So that's how I got started.
Oh, interesting. How what is the? I'm just this is kind of off the wall. What are the roots of the Nazarenes? Are they like connected to the Maronites, or do they come from like the Anabaptists? What?
No, the Nazarenes are they came from the Methodist movement. The Methodists started out of the Anglicans,
Okay.
and the Anglicans. And John Wesley was an Anglican priest till the day he died, but he started the Methodist movement as a movement within Anglicanism. But after his death, it became a separate denomination, and that happened in the 1700s. And then what happened in the 1800s was you had what was called the Holiness movement, which in some ways was similar to the charismatic movement of more recent times, because it was a movement that crossed denominational lines. And so you had Presbyterians that were part of the Holiness movement, like Charles Finney, who started off as a Presbyterian. And eventually most of the Methodists kicked the Holiness movement people out. But because of the Civil War, most denominations divided between the North and the South. And so you had the Northern Methodist Church that kicked all the Holiness people out, and then you had the Southern Methodist, which actually did not. So the Nazarene Church was never as big in the South as it was everywhere else. But it basically a bunch of smaller Holiness denominations merged together in 1908. And so the Nazarenes are the biggest Holiness denomination, although they're still, I think, about maybe less than 2 million people in the world. The Salvation Army is another Holiness movement denomination that most people don't even realize is a denomination. They think of it as a charity. But theologically, the Salvation Army and the Nazarene Church are pretty close.
Yeah. The Salvation Army is weird. I mean, because they do good work with their like rehab centers, but then it's like their officers are part of the church, and I don't know.
I actually almost became a Salvationist when I was in college because I liked a lot of the work that they did. And I started going to a Salvationist church in Oklahoma City, where I went to college in Bethany, which is right outside of Oklahoma City. And but I couldn't quite square the one way that they disagree with the Nazarenes, which is that they reject all sacraments. They reject the sacrament of baptism and communion, and they also don't believe in ordination. So instead of clergy, they have officers. So if you're a layman, you're an enlisted man, and if you're a clergyman, effectively, you're an officer. But they don't baptize people. You enroll, you sign the Articles of War, and you enlist in the army. And William Booth, who was the founder of the Salvation Army, he thought that the problem with the Anglicans was that people were baptized as infants and they didn't have any appreciation for what that meant. And so he just threw the whole thing out and said, none of that stuff matters, which, obviously sets them apart from every other Christian group in the world on that one point. But in terms of their theology, otherwise, they're identical to the Church of the Nazarene.
Interesting. Yeah, it's just a weird aesthetic with the army thing. So
yeah.
But what I brought you on today, I'm hearing a bit of an echo now. Are you hearing that, or?
I'm not hearing that, but I can turn your volume down and maybe that will help. Let me try that.
Okay. Sometimes headphones help. I don't know if you have those.
I don't have any handy. So is echo any better now?
I'm not hearing it anymore. So.
Okay. All right.
Okay, good. All right. Well, I wanted to bring you on today because, I think obviously it's a bit of a uncomfortable subject, sexual ethics, but I don't hear it broached very often, let's say in church, or even really from many Orthodox sources. I know I've written a little bit. I mean, I've read a little bit. I've read like maybe one book on it from an Orthodox author, and I think it was specifically on homosexuality. I can't quite remember the author. Maybe it was Father Thomas Hopko or something. But I think that it's kind of a shame because we hear about sexual ethics from all the wrong sources, especially from people who are trying to subvert the church and the church teaching on the matter. And so what are, my question to you to open it up is, what are Orthodox sexual ethics, and what sources of authority in the Holy Tradition help us to discern that?
Well, to put it really simply, the Orthodox sexual ethic is there's only one proper avenue for sexual expression, and that's in the context of marriage. And that's lawful marriage between a man and a woman who have a right to marry each other. Obviously, you can't marry your sister. You can't marry your mother. You can't marry a woman who's married to somebody else while she's still married to that person. So there are limitations on that. And but the Orthodox ideal is one man for one woman for life. And otherwise, there is obviously the path of celibacy. And there are some people who are called to that, and Christ said if someone can accept it, they should accept it. But if they can't, then that's another story. And St. Paul says they should be married. And so within the context of marriage, obviously, sexual ethics mean that you have to be faithful to your spouse, and the sexual relations have to be natural. And obviously that's where children come from. Ideally, they come from the context of marriage, and anything outside of marriage is some form of a deviation from that order. That, depending on how far away you get from that, the more broken it becomes. Because obviously, if you have sex outside of marriage, but it's between a man and a woman, you can still have life that's produced by that. And that's a good thing. And also that relationship could become a marriage, which could also develop into a good thing. But it's inappropriate because you don't have the commitment level between the two partners to sustain the relationship. Because what marriage is all about is making families. Marriage is not just about who you can have sex with. It's about who you want to make babies with and who you want to make a family with. And so in that context, sex is a good thing because it produces a family, it produces a small church, and it actually binds two families together. Families that maybe had no connection previously are suddenly bound by marriage, and then when children are produced, they're bound by blood. And so these are all good things that come from marriage, and anything that deviates from this is a sin. And when we have Orthodox people who try to make excuses for people who deviate from that, they're departing from the very basic teachings of the church. Because if you look at the very first council of the church in Acts chapter 15, the debate was, well, what do we do with these Gentiles? And there were some people who were saying that want to be Christians. And there were some people who said, well, they've got to become Jews. They've got to be circumcised. They've got to embrace the law of Moses. But that was not what was decided. What they decided was, well, we're not going to make Gentiles follow the law of Moses, but we are going to require some things of Gentiles. And among those things they were required to adhere to was to refrain from fornication, is a way that is usually translated. And fornication, the Greek word there is porneia, which is also where you get the word pornography from. But fornication means any kind of unlawful sexual activity. So that would include homosexuality, that would include adultery, that would include just hooking up with somebody. Anything outside of the context of marriage, that's fornication. So that's what the church has always taught. And as a matter of fact, Aristotle Papanikolaou at Public Orthodoxy likes to say, well, that's a matter of discipline rather than dogma. But if you read the book of Acts, the decrees of the Council of Jerusalem were called dogmas. And St. Paul, among other apostles, went around distributing these dogmas to the Gentile converts. So these are the very first dogmas of the church.
Interesting. Do any of the church fathers hit on it specifically? Or, I mean, I know I've read about it and it kind of, I mean, that quote from our public orthodoxy friend, I mean, it kind of, because I've heard monastics, I've read monastics kind of talk about it, but I can see how it could possibly be twisted into like a spiritual discipline, like fasting, so to speak. Do you know of any offhand any church fathers kind of making that distinction or kind of firmly reaffirming that?
Well, Christ himself in the book of Revelations and in the letters that were written to the 7 churches of Asia condemned the heresy of the Nicolaitans. And the Nicolaitans taught that sexual immorality didn't matter. Basically, they were saying that, what you do in the body is okay. We live in a fallen world, and it's only what your soul does that matters. So it doesn't matter what you do. You can engage in any kind of fornication. And this was referred to as a heresy by a number of fathers. It was one of the very first heresies in the church. And so it's mentioned by, I think it's Epiphanius in his Panarion against heresies. It's mentioned by St. Irenaeus in his Against Heresies. It's mentioned by several of the early fathers. And throughout church history, most heresies didn't deviate when it came to sexual morality. Like the Roman Catholics and the Orthodox, there's not a huge gap between what the Roman Catholic Church has traditionally taught about sexual morality and what the Orthodox Church has taught, or even most Protestants. It's only in modern times that you've got people who are trying to toss this out the window. But you're not a Christian if you say that it doesn't matter what you do, or that, between 2 consenting adults, what you do in your bedroom is just between the 2 of you. That's not Christianity. You're not a Christian by any measure.
Yeah. We have, there's going to be some awkward questions there just because of the topic from the audience. Alex Y, he says, how bad is the sin of masturbation? I guess he's asking.
Well, it is a sin, and in the canons of the church, I believe the penance was for 60 days, which is not to say that this is what would be imposed today, but I'm just telling you what the canons actually called for. I believe it was a 60-day penance of prayer, fasting, prostrations, basically eating bread and water to help someone get over the sin of masturbation. Now, the interesting thing is, if someone engaged in double masturbation, which means that they masturbated with somebody else, the penance was doubled. So they didn't engage in sexual penetration of another person, but they engaged in double masturbation, the penance was doubled for both people because now the sin involves somebody else. So it's obviously far more serious when you engage in a sin that involves somebody else than when you engage in a sin that only involves yourself. But it is indeed a sin.
Interesting. I never knew that canon with the so very specific.
Yep.
And I know some people are advocating for the church to modernize its views according to contemporary norms, and I think you just mentioned one of them, especially in regards to same-sex marriage. Often they cite settled science, suggesting that these people can't choose their orientation or whatnot. What would be your take on that perspective, or
Well, the science is pretty dubious that says that it's determined by your genes, because there's not any evidence that there actually is a gene that determines someone's sexual preference. Now, obviously, there are lots of scientists now that are trying to produce studies that satisfy the desires of the people who pay their bills. And we have to have a realistic assessment of what science is. If you went back to Nazi Germany, there were all kinds of scientists that were saying Hitler was right because Hitler was paying the bills. And so they produced all kinds of science that backed up his racial theories. Also, historians backed up his view of history and his view of racial history. And German scholars were the best scholars in the world, and to some extent remain the best scholars in the world. And you could even argue that some of the best scholars remain German scholars. I mean, that's where the university came into, the modern university came into being, was in Germany. And so these were the top-notch minds of the world, and yet they produced scholarship that backed up stuff that we now know to be garbage. And how is that? Well, that's because scholars are human beings, and if they know that they have to parrot a certain party line to get their scholarship accepted or to get a position in a university, they'll gladly do it. So you have lots of scholars that say all kinds of garbage. But even if you could produce some evidence that there was a genetic predisposition to homosexuality, it really wouldn't change the equation. Because, for example, we know there's a genetic predisposition to be an alcoholic. But, if you have a genetic predisposition to be an alcoholic, try when you get pulled over for drunk driving, explaining to the police officer or to the judge that you later see, well, I was born this way. Well, that wouldn't work. They would say, well, you may have the predisposition, but you still have the choice. And you made the wrong choice. And so we're going to put you in the Huskow. And the same thing is true of any kind of perversion. I mean, there are some people who think there might be a genetic predisposition to be a pedophile. But I think most sane people, at least at this point in history, I wouldn't say anything about the future, given the trajectory of our moral compass in the society, but at least at the moment, most people would agree that pedophilia is not something that we can say is okay, even if some people want to say that it's a orientation. So if someone had a predisposition to be a pedophile, we would say, well, you know what, you need to deal with it. Otherwise, we're going to lock your rear end in jail, or maybe we should just take you out behind the courthouse and put you out of your misery. But we're not going to let you diddle little kids. And the same thing is true of homosexuality. And when I say this, you automatically have homosexuals that will say, oh, you're comparing homosexuals to pedophiles, and pedophiles are much worse than homosexuals. Well, pedophilia is worse than homosexuality, to be sure. But we're talking about predispositions and sexual orientations right now. And so there is an analogy. And the analogy is that if a predisposition or an orientation doesn't justify pedophilia, then that would mean that the same thing wouldn't necessarily justify homosexuality. And certainly if you care anything about what the scriptures or the canons of the church have to say, then you would know that you can't justify those things.
Yeah. And there may or may not be a 40% correlation, but I won't expound. So So many of us will struggle with various passions, including lust and the periphery things that normally go along with it. Pornography, masturbation. So what in particular though makes homosexuality an important concern that is kind of unique in contrast to those other I guess sexual deviancies?
Well, obviously, homosexuality involves another person. So just as masturbation is worse if you involve somebody else in it, homosexuality is worse than, say, viewing pornography because it involves other people. So it's one thing to imperil your own soul, but it's a much worse thing to imperil somebody else's soul. And also, homosexuality is contrary to nature. And you have all kinds of people who will say, "Oh, but I've seen dogs that will, hump male dogs that will hump other male dogs." Well, the thing is, animals do all kinds of things. Animals will eat their young in some cases, but we don't say, well, because animals eat their young, therefore it's okay for us to do so. And generally, when you see male animals mounting another male, it's actually an expression of dominance rather than an expression of any kind of a sexual orientation, because those same animals will more readily mount a female of the same species if they're in heat. And also, the other thing is, there's certain animals, like if you have a female dog that's in heat, you've got dogs that start reacting in a certain way, and they might start mounting other male dogs just because they're having that reaction, and they're not necessarily being very discerning. But this is not evidence that it's not contrary to nature, because there's a very simple fact about nature, and that's that we are plumbed a certain way. And the human anus was not designed with the human penis in mind. And the health effects of sodomy demonstrate this. This is why homosexuals tend to die young, because this is not what God intended for human anatomy. And the fact that homosexuals tend to die young because of disease, also because of depression and suicide, are reasons why, if we care about them, we should try to steer them in a more healthy direction. Because if you care about people, you don't want to see them kill themselves. You don't want to see them doing drugs. You don't want to see them become alcoholics. But these are all things that homosexuals tend to fall into, because their lifestyle causes them to be disgusted by themselves and their own behavior. And you can say, well, that's only because we have so many people like you that are going around telling these homosexuals that what they're doing is wrong. But the same statistics bear true in societies that are hardly Christian anymore, like in Denmark or in the Netherlands, where there's not a very significant Christian presence anymore. It's a very secular country. You see the same dynamics as you see in the United States. So these things are just facts of nature.
Yeah, one thing I find interesting is, and I'm not quite sure why this is, but I don't quite see communities being built around other types of passions or sins. Like I don't see like adulterer or pride, or I just don't I just don't see that sort of like advocacy or community and pride built around a single sin. What is it, do you think, that kind of contributes to like the whole LGBTQ pride thing and this like vehement, almost militaristic defense of it? That's just different. I haven't seen it with, I mean, of course we've seen it develop basically since they got the right to quote unquote marry. It's turned into transgenderism and all this other stuff, but and now they're all kind of lumped together. But what do you think is the cause behind that that's different than everything else?
Well, the gay rights movement goes back to the 70s. And in the early stages, you could say that it was probably motivated by the fact that there were actually laws against what they were doing, and the police would go into a gay bar and arrest people. And so you had gay people that weren't happy about that and expressed their disapproval. But that's long since ceased to be the case. And so at this point, I think that what motivates them is the same thing that motivates atheists to spend all their time trying to convince people that they're right. Because if you think about it, if you're an atheist, you don't believe that there's a God, why do you care that there are people who believe in God? It actually puts you at an advantage because they're bound by certain moral structures and you're not. So why are you bothered by the fact that people believe in something that you don't think is true? And with homosexuals, I think that they're bothered by the fact that they know that what they're doing is wrong and contrary to nature, and they want you to tell them that it's correct. They want you to tell them that you approve of it, that you applaud. And if you don't applaud loudly enough or long enough, then they're going to say that you're a bigot.
We do have a super chat from Luke Kindrat over at Orthodoxy First, who says, "Good to see Father John and Michael on a stream together. God bless you both." Well, God bless you too, Luke. Let's see. Alex Y says, "What are your thoughts on the gender theory?"
Well, I think it's a bunch of nonsense. I mean, the fact that when you ask people who talk about all the various genders to name all the genders, you generally are going to find that they can't name more than about 10 of them, even though they'll tell you that there's 50, 100, or maybe some infinite number of genders, and these are all just made up designations that don't have any actual meaning. And we can't really function in a society where we have to guess what somebody's pronoun is or what gender they are. And there's a certain fact of biology. We all have chromosomes, and our chromosomes tell us what gender we are. And it's just a biological fact. And the left likes to call conservative science deniers on other subjects. But when it comes to gender theory, they're the science deniers, and they don't seem to be bothered by that at all. Science says that there are two sexes. There are some people who are obviously born with some kind of a genetic anomaly, and there are some people who have a deformity, but the human species has a male and a female sex. That's just the way that it works, and our biologies are different as a result of that. And you can put all the makeup on a man that you want. You can chop this off and put this in and squeeze in this silicone implant here or there, and you might make somebody look like they're a woman in some cases, although usually it's pretty obvious that they're not. But you might make someone look like they're a woman, but every cell in their body is crying out and saying that they're a man, and that's the reality. And the estrogen that they're taking is going to kill them in the long run. They're not going to live long because estrogen is a bad thing for somebody who's a male. And the same thing is true in reverse. Females have a certain biology, and you can do whatever you want to them, but they're not going to become men just because they wish to be men, or because you make them look like men. They're going to be females, and every cell in their body is going to be crying out and saying that they're a woman.
Yeah, I've heard some pushback against even using the term gender because of, it's kind of a word that's kind of controlled by the left. I mean, should it even be thought of in a sort of sense separate from biology with sex?
Well, gender is really a grammatical term. Okay. In some languages you have a neuter gender, but that doesn't mean that you have human beings that are neuter. And everything is either male or female in Spanish, or, either feminine or masculine. But there are some languages that have no gender. Chinese has no gender. Turkish has no gender. And so if you believe in the gender theory, particularly when it comes to how they want to try to change our language, you would have to think that Chinese culture and Turkish culture are the most tolerant, pro-women, pro-gay cultures on the face of the earth. But when you actually look at those cultures, you'll find that you're going to end up with pretty much the opposite reality.
Yeah, I know that there was a Johns Hopkins study long ago with the gender dysphoria, and I think it's pretty much been Johns Hopkins has caved to the pressure and denounced the study. There was a doctor, I can't remember his name, but he developed the transition therapy, the sex change therapy, to treat, because he thought that it would treat gender dysphoria and reduce their suicide rates, and it turned out to have either no effect or increase their suicide rates. So I mean, how would you? Obviously, these people are, and I would extend this. This isn't politically correct to say, but I would extend. I've even written an article about this years ago. That there's if homosexuality isn't a mental illness, that is definitely correlated to it. Most of them have some form of suffering from depression or anxiety at the very least, schizophrenia, etc., and gender dysphoria is still listed in the ADA as as an official mental illness. So how do we? I guess what is the proper way for, especially pastorally, but as Orthodox Christians, how do we broach these people? How do we approach these people without enabling, but at the same time, I guess what's the right way to deal with this if we encounter such a person?
Well, I think we have to treat it as a sin issue, because the idea of mental illness is a fairly modern concept, but it's a secular way of examining what the church has always examined as a spiritual illness. And matter of fact, psychology literally means the study of the soul. And so from an Orthodox perspective, if you understand soul in the spiritual sense, we would agree that it's a psychological problem, but it's not a psychological problem in the modern sense of the term. And so we have to treat it as a sin. And the more people engage in that kind of sin, the further they get away from the truth. And if you read Romans chapter 1, what Romans chapter 1 tells us is that people know what the truth is, but they try to suppress the truth in unrighteousness, and they wind up not only rejecting the faith, but they end up in sexual immorality, which is what the whole chapter is pointing out. Because if you reject the truth, you end up embracing a lie. And the lie today is that a man could be a woman and a woman could be a man, or that two men can have a marriage. That's a lie. The traditional definition of what constitutes a legal marriage requires a male and a female. The consummation of a marriage cannot happen between two men or two women. So we've had to toss out, centuries worth of legal understanding of what constitutes a consummated marriage to facilitate this nonsense.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of people, I know when we talk about sin and whatnot, I think what comes to mind in a lot of people's mind is like a punishment, right? Whereas, could you kind of explain how it's a little different as the hospital for the soul in the Orthodox Church? Why it's not quite like the Western understanding of just jurisprudence, justice, so to speak, and just kind of clarify, I guess, how the church would approaches dealing with sin, really.
Well, the thing is, I think a lot of Orthodox people go to an opposite extreme when you only talk about the church as a spiritual hospital, but you then toss out all the legal images that you find in Scripture. Because, for example, a couple Sundays back, we celebrated the Sunday of the Last Judgment. We didn't celebrate the Sunday of the final medical exam. The idea of judgment is a legal image. Now, all the images that we have in Scripture are trying to give us some idea of a reality that's beyond normal human experience. And so you don't want to just focus on one image. You want to take all the images together and understand them, because there certainly is the healing aspect of how the church approaches sin. And we want people to be healed of the disease of sin, and we want them to become whole, which is related to the concept of holiness. We want people to be holy, and but it's also true that if you live a life of sin and you reject God, that you ultimately face a judgment, and that's not just God patting you on the head and telling you that he loves you, but that's God telling you, depart from me, I never knew you, because you rejected him at every point, even despite everything that he did to try to bring you to the truth and bring you to repentance. And so there's an unpleasant side to what we believe about sin, and that's that there ultimately is some eternal consequences to living a life of sin.
So what advice would you give to those struggling with sexual sins such as homosexuality, sex or porn addiction, masturbation, or any other form of sexual deviancy? Maybe a combination of both spiritual and practical advice.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of things that you would need to do. I mean, obviously, if you're an Orthodox Christian, you want to be talking to a spiritual father who's going to help you deal with this, and you want to be accountable and go to confession on a regular basis, because any kind of a sexual sin is an addiction on a certain level. And we know about someone who's a drug addict. There are a lot of drug addicts and alcoholics that you could ask, would you like to be free from your addiction? And they would raise their hand and say, oh, I would love to be free from my addiction. But they very often have a hard time breaking away from it, because that addiction has a very strong draw. And the same thing is true of sexual addictions. And, pornography, for example, they've done studies on the effect that pornography has on the brain, and it is stronger than heroin in terms of the effect that it has on the brain. And so it makes sense that people who get into pornography have a hard time breaking away from it. But there are certain things that you can do. I mean, obviously, aside from being accountable to a spiritual father and going to confession regularly, which will help, because you could cry into your pillow every night instead, but God's not usually going to give you a response. But when you go to a spiritual father and you confess sins, then that accountability that you have will give you an extra incentive, and also someone else who's praying for you to overcome these sins. But one of the most basic things you have to do with any sin, particularly sexual sins, is you have to cut off the fuel supply. And one of the proverbs says, where there is no wood, the fire goeth out. And so if you're constantly exposing yourself to pornography, you're going to have a hard time getting over it. And so how do you cut it off? Well, fortunately, there are internet filters that you could put on your computer. There's a service that I believe the website is like pluckeye.com, as in pluck out your eye rather than go to hell, but from the Gospels, but pluckeye.com. And if you put that on, if I've not used it, but the description says something along the lines that it blocks websites that it recognizes or thinks are porn, and you can override it. So, for example, if you legitimately were trying to get to a website that it was blocking you from, but you knew that it was a legit site, you can unblock that site, but it doesn't unblock immediately. I think it takes a couple of hours for it to unblock. And the point there is that it gives you a chance to think about whether you really want to do that. Because most sexual sins are entered into in the heat of the moment. You allow yourself to get into a temptation, and when you cross a certain line, it's pretty hard to go back. But what the fathers say about any kind of sin, the analogy that they use in the Desert Fathers is you don't want to dance on the edge of a cliff. Because when you're on the edge of a cliff, it's easy for somebody to come up behind you and just give you a little push, and then off you go. But if you keep your distance from the cliff, if somebody comes along and they try to drag you to throw you off the cliff, you have time to resist, which is your own efforts to overcome the sin, but you also have time to cry out for help, which is prayer. So you have a chance to ask God to help you to overcome the sin. So you want to keep your distance from these. sins. And you want to ask yourself, what are the patterns that I keep falling into, and how do I short circuit these patterns? And so, for example, if you're single and you've got a girlfriend and you keep falling into fornication with your girlfriend, well, you know what? If you keep getting in the back seat of the car with her without any changes to your behavior, chances are pretty good you're not going to overcome it. You're probably going to have to find a girlfriend that actually has the same faith that you have and wants to help you to overcome that sin. And then the two of you are going to have to work together to not put yourself in a situation where that sin is likely to start happening. Because, as I heard someone say years ago, your hormones don't know that you're a Christian. And if you put yourself in a situation where you're a single guy and you're in the back seat of the car with a female who's attractive, and you start engaging in certain kind of behaviors, your hormones are going to kick in, and at a certain point it's going to be almost impossible for you to say no. What you want to do is not put yourself in the back seat of the car, and that takes some discipline. That takes saying no. But that's what the whole ascetic life in the Orthodox Church is all about. That's why we fast. We don't fast because cheeseburgers are inherently sinful. We fast because if we learn how to say no to a cheeseburger, we hopefully will learn how to say no to get in the back seat of the car with our girlfriend until we're married. And that's what we need to work on.
Yeah. I know one book I think about is Our Thoughts Determine Our Lives. And I just that I get it goes through just the pattern of from temptation to and that's like the time to cast it out. It's like as soon as it comes. But then if you start dwelling on it, well, then you're already veering into sin. I was wondering if
there are
you
also
have
some good books by the fathers on the passions, and one of them is St. John Cassian's Conferences. And if you go to the old Erdman series by Philip Schaff, you'll find that the chapter on fornication is left in Latin because back in the 1800s, when this text was published, they figured, well, that's kind of a risque subject. We don't want the average person to be able to read, so we're going to leave it in Latin for the scholars. But fortunately, you can get a translation from Paulus Press that actually will tell you what St. John Cassian had to say about fornication. And the important thing to keep in mind about the passions is St. John Cassian and the other fathers also talk about how the passions are related. They're connected. So you have to learn how to deal with not just one passion, but all the passions.
Yeah. Looks like we have a super chat from Brittany Dumas and a question. She says, "Hi, Father, and hello, Michael. What are your thoughts on eunuchs, and could you please explain their biblical context? Is there a connection with modern transgenderism? I know hermaphroditism is a rare genetic disorder as well."
Well, there are a very small number of people who are born as hermaphrodites, which means that they have some sexual characteristics of both genders, and they have some kind of a genetic anomaly. In some cases, at least. In other cases, they might actually have an XY chromosome, but they might have a not fully formed penis and a vagina or something like that. So these are things that a doctor in modern times might be able to deal with when the child's an infant and fix. But in some cases, and certainly in ancient times, they didn't have any means to fix these kinds of things. And so that's what Christ was talking about when he said some people are born eunuchs. And so some people are born without the ability to engage in normal sex. And so they're born eunuchs, and other people are made eunuchs of men. So people who are made eunuchs in those days, if you were a servant to a king, and he wanted you to be an attendant to his wives, first thing he would do would be to castrate you to make sure that he didn't have to worry about how you interacted with his wives. And then if you survived the castration, which wasn't always the case, but if you did survive the castration, then you would be a court official. And in some societies, eunuchs actually became very powerful because they were trusted by the king, but obviously they didn't have any kids, so you didn't have to worry about them having a dynasty or anything like that. But it definitely is related. And in most cases today, the people who are having these transgender issues are not people who have a genetic anomaly. They're people who've been brainwashed by the culture. Because I think we now have something like 15% of people who are thinking that they're some kind of transgendered something or other, at least in some countries. And you didn't have anything like that. When I was in high school and college, there was nobody who was running around saying I'm transgendered or I'm a man trapped in a woman's body or anything like that. I'm sure obviously there were some people who had some issues, gender dysphoria, and I think the first sex change operation maybe happened in the 50s or the 60s in Sweden. So some of the stuff goes back a little bit further. But prior to modern technology, you had no means to change your plumbing. You had no means to take hormones that you didn't naturally produce. And so people were just born a certain way and they had to live with it.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't remember, even when I was in high school, I don't remember this stuff happening. This was very, I don't remember even this in college. And I graduated high school in 2005. And
well, the crazy thing of this is, I remember back when the whole gay marriage thing was being debated before the Supreme Court decided to impose it on everybody and not allow the democratic process to run its course. I remember people who were basically saying, oh, they want to get married, just go ahead and let them get married, then they'll leave us alone. And what I try to tell people is they're not going to leave us alone when this passes. And it was like the same week the Supreme Court came out that we suddenly started hearing all these issues about men using women's bathrooms and stuff like that. So they immediately jumped on to the next thing. And I guarantee you that if society suddenly becomes okay with hairy-legged men using the ladies' room and competing in women's sports, we suddenly all decide, okay, well, that's okay. Hopefully they'll leave us alone. They're going to move on to the next thing, and the next thing might be pedophilia.
I think they're
not going to
there.
stop. So giving in on anything doesn't make any sense. When you're dealing with cultural terrorists, the only way you deal with cultural terrorists is to say, hell no, we're not going there. And that's what we need to have said a long time ago and what we need to start saying.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just the other day, or a couple of weeks ago, there was a pedophile posting something about, basically saying pedophilia is okay. And Lauren Witzke just retweeted it and said demonic. And they kicked her off. They kicked her off. So I think we're if we're not there, we're right on the cliff, so to speak.
Well, to clean up an expression that I heard a long time ago and found to be true, nothing hacks people off like the truth.
Yeah. And I think since the topic's already been brought up with the hermaphrodite thing, or people born with these deformities, they do account for less than 1% of transgender operations or people with gender dysphoria. But it's used for almost like 99% of their argumentation. So it's good to keep that into perspective. Dex,
and the suicide rates among people who've actually had a sex change operation ought to make anyone who actually cares about these people say this is a bad solution.
Yeah,
but the unfortunate thing is we have people with agendas that don't have anything to do with the well-being of the people that they claim to be advocating for.
Yeah, that's true. Over on Entropy, a gentleman named Dex gave a very generous donation. I don't even want to know what to say. He says, Father John is awesome. Thanks for all you do, Michael. So we're both of us are getting some love tonight. So that's pretty much all the questions that I have. We have about 10 minutes left. I don't know. Did you have any final thoughts that you want to get out there to tie everything together and wrap it all up?
Well, one thing I would say is that I think we all need to be speaking out on these issues, and I think it's a real disservice that there have been so few clergy who have talked about these kinds of issues in sermons. And, if we were still living in the 1950s, you might have been able to justify that by saying, well, you know what, most of these people don't know anything about this, and so why should we pollute the minds of innocent people by bringing up these kinds of issues? But we are not in that world, and the children in every parish are being propagandized by this kind of nonsense. I have a family in my parish that was telling me that their daughter had an assignment, and this is in Houston Independent School District, so this is in Texas. Their daughter had an assignment. She had to write the biography of one of a selection of LGBTQ, WXYZ people. And so you're making a child who's like 13 years old spend their time examining the life and writing an article or an essay, which presumably would have to be affirmative of this person. And that's propaganda. And so clergy need to be speaking out about it, because every child in your parish is being exposed to this kind of stuff. And you need to be telling your people, get your kids out of public schools, homeschool them, put them into private schools. Even if you do a bad job homeschooling your kids, you're going to be doing a better job than the propaganda that they're going to be getting in the private schools. And so we have to take a stand. And you don't take a stand at your own peril. I mean, it's already the case that there are some parts of the country where there are parishes that if the priest was to say anything about this, he would have people in an uproar. But you know what? If you got people in an uproar because you speak the truth about homosexuality, then you need to go ahead and get them in an uproar, find out who they are, and if you can't persuade them, tell them to get the hell out of your church. Because, if they don't believe the truth, that's why we have such a things as anathemas, which we read on Sunday. That's why we have things like excommunication. It's not because we want people to leave the church, but we don't want them to think they're in the church when spiritually they've already excommunicated themselves. We have to draw clear lines, because when you don't draw clear lines, you're responsible for the fact that people delude themselves into thinking that they're perfectly acceptable Orthodox Christians when they don't believe anything like what the church believes. Yeah. So we have to take a stand, and the longer we don't take a stand, the harder it's going to be to take a stand. And eventually, we're going to get to the point where anyone who takes a stand is going to be risking going to the Hooskow. And if it comes to that, if you believe in the gospel, if you believe in the Orthodox faith, you should be prepared to go there. But the old saying about a stitch in time saves 9, or an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, that's been true for a long time. And we're past the point where the ounce of prevention would help, but maybe a half pound of prevention at this point might be worth a pound of cure. Do what you can. Fight for the truth. Don't just allow your people to go to hell without you even telling them where they're headed.
Yeah. I mean, aside from just the priests, do you think that we could benefit from some sort of clarity and something from our bishops? Is that something we could?
Well, the bishop should speak up, and the laity should speak up. Back in, I think it was the Epistle of the Eastern Patriarchs to Pope Pius the something or other. I think it was either 1848 or later in the 19th century. But in that letter, they made the famous statement that the people are the guardians of the faith, or the guardians of piety, is the way they actually put it. And when you take, for example, the Council of Florence, where you had all these bishops that agreed to go into union with Rome, a shameful union, where Rome made no concessions, and the Orthodox did, and they came back to Constantinople, and people asked them what they had agreed to, the people rejected it. They showered the bishops with rotten fruit and stones. They didn't shower them with rose petals and adulation. So the people need to speak up. Because one thing I can tell you is bishops feel very free to ignore the opinions of their priest. And, it depends on the bishop, of course. But to some extent, I mean, they have every right to do that because priests and deacons serve only at their pleasure. But when the people get in an uproar, bishops will pay attention because they know if they don't have any people, they don't have any church. And so speak up. Let the bishops know. And I'm afraid we're already headed for a schism in the Orthodox Church in the United States over some of these issues because we've allowed these things to fester for too long. And we've already got parishes where the LGBTQ agenda is already so embedded that you probably have to go in, with a fumigation and a flamethrower to clean things up at this point. But most parishes are not there at this point. But if we don't take a clear stand, we're going to lose a lot of people. And then it's going to really cost you to take a stand. So take a stand now when it only costs you a little bit, so that you maybe don't have to take a stand when it's going to cost you maybe your life.
Yeah. Maybe my petitions are a little too nice. Maybe we, yeah. But I think they're actually making. I know that they've had some impact, a little bit. So I haven't really done the call to action on the latter one. But.
Well, fortunately, we have a lot of bishops that are very clear on these issues, and obviously the Russian Church abroad, our bishops have no sympathy for these things. I wish that they would issue some more regular statements on these issues, not because I think they've changed their minds, but just because people need to be reminded. But the Antiochian bishops, I know, have no sympathy for this. Bishop Antun, I was told by an Antiochian priest, he was speaking to some conference of clergy and laity, and he's an old school Middle Easterner, and he just said, "What is this? What is this? Men with men? What is this?" So Arab bishops have no time for this kind of stuff. But unfortunately, we have some bishops that have been a little bit more tolerant than they should be, and maybe are a little bit too sympathetic. And the laity need to let them know that that's not acceptable. They need to be given a backbone by their people.
Yeah. And honestly, we need to being loud is effective, and it those of us on the right, or the more conservative types, it's kind of against our it's against our constitution, or our bearing to be like that. But I think it's important to get as much attention and to be as more. We have to overbear the subversives and the people spreading this stuff. So I mean, and I know for us it's difficult to get to that point, but because it's just not how we are. It's just but
we need to be. Our forefathers didn't have a problem with speaking their minds, so we should speak it too.
It's true. That's true. So I haven't done this to a guest in a while, but I have a long-standing tradition of asking my guests, totally unprepared, for a book recommendation, one that you haven't mentioned already on the show, and not the Holy Scriptures. Just
well, on this particular issue, there's a really good book by Robert Gagnon, and it's called, and he's not an Orthodox, but he's a Presbyterian, I believe, or a Baptist scholar, and it's called The Bible and Homosexual Practice. And it's one of the most thorough treatments of what the Scriptures and also the tradition, amazingly, has to say about homosexuality and transgenderism. It's an excellent book. And so if you want to find out what the Scriptures say, that's a very good treatment. Now, also on ethical issues, back in the year 2000, the Russian Church published a document that was called The Basis of the Social Concept of the Russian Orthodox Church. And you can find this in English on several websites, but they deal with things like homosexuality and transgenderism, and they give very clear guidance on the subject. And even including the practical questions of such things as what should a priest do if a guy who has had a sex change to being a woman, supposedly, shows up at your church and wants to embrace the Orthodox faith, how should you deal with that? And it tells them, well, you should deal with them as if they're still a man, because they in fact are. And you can go ahead and baptize them, but they would be baptized as a male, and they should be instructed to turn away from that lifestyle. So these are both things I would recommend on this particular subject.
All right. Well, I appreciate you coming on, Father John. Could you, why don't you give your blog a shout? Because that's, I think, one of the pearls of the internet these days.
It's I think it's Father John Whiteford at .blogspot.com, but it's not an easy to remember address. But if you just type in Father John Whiteford into Google or some other search engine, it'll pop up. And so that blog, I've been at it since I think 2004, and so it's got a lot of stuff that deals with these issues. You also find it if you go to Saint spelled out SAINT Saint spelled out Jonah with no dot between them .org, and go to the articles section. You'll find the link to the blog as well as some other articles that I've written over the years.
All right. Well, it's been a pleasure to have you on, and hopefully maybe someday we can bring you back. It was a good, true pleasure. A little salty that you went on Luke Kindrat's show first, but I'm just kidding. We love Luke. So right. Thank you very much, everyone, for watching, and thank you, Father John.
Thank you.